Asha had learned how to make herself small the way other girls learned needlework. She folded into corners, hushed her laughter, swallowed the sharp corners of her opinions until they flattened into something useful. Silence. The market spat at her when she walked by, mothers flashing the warning look that kept children from touching the wrong kind of dirt. The men who counted wolves and grain gave her the look that meant she might be sold for a debt. Her mother had called her soft. Her brothers had called her a waste. The village had whispered omega, wolfless, barren, listings that read like a ledger where Asha had no place but as an entry to be corrected.
When the caravan came with the king's seal stitched into black cloth, Asha had been sweeping the same dust she had been sweeping for 10 years. Her hands knew the rhythm of rejection: scrape, gather, let go. The man with the seal moved like a half-remembered rumor, all distance and careful teeth, and he stopped where the women drifted like moths. He lifted a ledger, his fingers inked with court stench, and his voice measured names like verdicts. He said tribute. He said the king required a healer for the private wing. He said the king's mood was storm and the king's guests preferred not to die. Asha had not expected to be chosen. She had not expected to be watched. When the man fixed his eyes on her, something cold and routed lit there, as if he could see through every scraped knuckle and every shabby dress to a lack that was supposed to matter. The village priest muttered, and a neighbor pressed a packet of dried beans into her palm, an ingratiation, something to trade for mercy. Asha clung to beans. She let herself be led, because there was no other answer. The caravan bound in black banners left behind the smell of old leather and old promises. Asha left behind the one small borrowed life she had grown used to and stepped into the long corridor of the king's fortress. The fortress did not smell like the market. It smelled of stone and iron and a sour breath that felt like it belonged to someone who had not smiled in a long time. Servants with eyes like glass took her name with practiced indifference and escorted her through halls that swallowed sound. They took her to a wing where patients were kept for the king's private needs, where no one came in unsentenced time. The door to the private wing opened with a sound like a blade being drawn. She saw him first as a shadow in the dim. He was wrapped in black and gold like a moonless night embroidered with stars. The rumors had told 1,000 ways to fear him: the Alpha King, the blooded, the man who had ended wars before they began. People said he smelled of wolves and ash. They said his voice could split a room and his gaze could slaughter reputations. Asha stood where she had been told to stand, hands folded, chin up, because that was the face you had to show the powerful. Her fear made her breath small and sharp. He moved with a deliberate, dangerous sort of slowness that made her skin crawl and also made her heart drum foolishly at the base of her throat. He had a face that had been carved and not finished. It harbored both beauty and something like a cliff edge. Scars fanned across his jaw in pale relief, a map of storms past. His eyes were black wells, and occasionally, when he blinked too slowly, she thought she saw something in them like a child's ache. He regarded her as one regards a puzzle, with an economy of expression that could have been cruelty or study. "You are Asha of Highwell," he said. His voice had the cadence of a bell that would not be struck for amusement. It left little room for the ordinary courtesies that might comfort a woman ripped from her village. She answered crisply because silence felt like failing. "Yes, Your Majesty." He did not smile. That absence carried with it a warning. "You know the role of a healer in my house." She swallowed and said what she had practiced for herself in the nights when hunger crept into her bones. To mend, to keep the king whole, to soothe what ails him. He studied her fingers as if searching for proof. "Do you know how to keep a secret?" His voice softened, not a kindness but a threat that wrapped like silk. "The people who do not keep my secrets find that other people are less sympathetic." Asha had kept secrets her entire life, of her father's temper, her mother's debts, the way her own desires felt wrong and unwelcome. She could bind secrets with the same deftness she used to dress wounds. "I do," she said. It was the safest answer. It was the answer that brought 3 steps closer to a place where she could hide. She learned fast that the king's fortress was a different gravity. Days were carved by ritual and necessity. A bed that had once been too broad felt insufficiently private. She slept in a room that overlooked a courtyard, where wolves sometimes trotted in packs, checked and leashed by guards who softened only under his gaze. She learned the court's steps. Do not speak when the guards looked away. Do not laugh when the nobles closed their mouths. Do not catch the gaze of men who tasted of rot and ambition. She learned to fold herself like a page and hold the corners until the world pretended not to burn. The work itself suited her. She was good at tending bruises and easing fever. People with ordinary injuries found salvation in her hands. Her fingers moved like birds over skin, coaxing pain out of muscle and stitching torn tissue. There was a quiet triumph in being useful, in a world that had declared her value nil. The king required more than dressings. He required someone whose hands could be trusted near his flesh. He required someone whom rumor would not claim as a threat. Her first few weeks were an apprenticeship in silence. He saw her perform and made no comment. Sometimes he would have her attend to the minor courtiers, and she would listen to the flutter of his presence in the next room like a dark animal. She learned the ways his servants coughed when they meant to tell him something, and the way the guards straightened their shoulders when they wanted to be seen. Every inch of the fortress felt keyed to his temper. There was an event, as inevitable in kingdoms as the turning of seasons, that announced itself with fanfare and the clatter of armored feet, the Festival of Wolves. The festival claimed to celebrate strength and lineage, but it was mostly a parade of the powerful showing their teeth. Noble families brought gifts, alliances were murmured, and the king accepted both favor and tribute with the efficiency of an executioner. Asha's presence at the festival was purely functional. She sat behind a screen in a tent that smelled of spiced meat and polished steel, prepared to heal the bruises of men who mistook strength for arrogance. The closer she got to the center of the arena, the more heat rose from the crowd. Heat and hunger, and her skin prickled as if she had stepped into an animal's lair. The king sat elevated on a dais like an altar. He watched everything and nothing at once, eyes skimming the lines of the crowd like a pair of knives. Halfway through the festival, a group of cloaked riders stormed the gates. The crowd froze and then divided like a stream around a rock. The cloaks split as if someone had cut them, revealing the sigil of a rival house. They moved with practiced intent, not just to be seen, but to strike. The chaos was quick. A flare of steel, a scream, a man on the dais falling like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Panic spread like a flame. Asha moved because fingers know their trade faster than hearts know fear. She pushed between stumbling nobles and toppled scaffolding and reached the dais. The man who had fallen was no stranger to her hand. He was one of the king's advisors, and he bled in a way that made the festival taste of iron. She knelt and worked, murmuring the names of bones and vessels like prayers. The crowd blurred into a wash of color. Over and over she steadied the hot, ragged breath of a man who had sought to change fate with a blade. She did not notice at first when the king stepped down from the dais. She realized he stood behind her when someone seized her wrist, and the world cut into a new slice of bright and cold. He had leaned close enough that the air between them burned. She met his gaze and saw the first real flicker of unsoftened something. Interest. It was a dangerous thing to catch from a man who preferred to be looked at as if he were a weapon. "You are quick," he said. There was no praise in it. He sounded like an assessor reading the specifications of a fine weapon. "You would prefer I be slow?" she asked, surprising herself with the smallness of her defiance. Defiance had been a luxury the market had not afforded, but here, in the echo of the riot, it tasted like brine. He did not answer with words. He reached down and, with a motion that betrayed nothing of his intentions, placed a fragment of the advisor's cloak in her palm. It was embroidered with a thread she could not name, and the weight of it hummed against her skin. "Trust is currency here," he said at last. "Keep mine." The festival became a hinge. Men were punished, traitors hunted. But the king's hands did not seek to shake the unsteady balance of power. Instead, he turned his attention to something stranger and quieter than rebellion, to Asha's hands. He had made her his healer in name and in practice, but he also drew her into the world of his solitude, allowing her to see the small infractions that shaped him. The vulnerability he harbored seeped out like water through mortar. It was not dramatic, like a monster's curse or crimson with violence. It was more like a bruise you only noticed when you scrubbed the arch of your hand across your skin and felt the tender throb. He could not bear sunlight for long, it seemed. He kept his windows heavily curtained, as if the day itself might betray him. On some mornings he moved as if his bones were too heavy for the hours, and he would sink into a chair and not rise. His hands trembled sometimes, an almost imperceptible shiver that upset his composure, and once, while Asha bandaged a torn palm, she noticed the scar at the base of his thumb that pulsed like a hidden lie. There were other signs, less physical and more like the way a song sometimes lingers at the edges of hearing. He had enemies who dared not step into the sunlight. He slept in armor. He ate in silence. He kept pictures of people who were not there. The guards called him a demon for his focus, and a pariah for his solitude. Meanwhile, the council praised him for decisive cruelty. He had been king long enough that his name had the weight of history. When the courtiers whispered his secret, they did so as if by mentioning it, they would absolve themselves or warn others to keep distance. The vulnerability, though, ran deeper than sun or sleep. Asha began to piece together the old stories that never made it into the official archives. A binding, perhaps, a loneliness sealed with magic, a cost paid in blood. He did not flinch when she treated him, which in some men meant dominance. In him it meant something like ignorance and something like a plea. Once, when his breath was particularly ragged, he told no one but the night watch and a spider that crawled along a beam what his body had lost. He said it as if he were cataloging a failure. The words themselves were not dramatic. Blindness was too simple and monsters too clumsy. Instead, he described a thing that made him different, a sickness of trust, a wound that kept him from bringing anyone close enough to matter. Asha felt a traitorous compassion swell in her chest toward a man she had been taught to fear. The compassion rose and pulled like tide. It frightened her more than any threat did. She knew how to soothe flesh. She was less certain how to soothe the ache in a person's soul. Perhaps everyone is born with a kind of thirst, and she was only now learning to identify it, to be seen by someone not as an omega or a defect, but as a force. She had spent her life deflecting sharp looks and softer words alike. The warnings of the court did not keep her away. There were bastions of hatred that stretched like brambled hedges. Her own family's shame flared in the faces of those who saw her walk the hall, wearing a ring that denoted official servitude to the king's inner court. They would whisper and spit and claim she had traded her body for favors. But the king's need made her indispensable, and the fortress required healers who owed no one else anything. She slept poorly and dreamed frequently of children she could not bear, of wolves that smelled like salt, of a man whose shadow never left him. The binding came in the night, sudden as a storm. Asha had been called to the king's bedchamber to stitch a skin torn by jagged glass. The cut ran long and ugly across his forearm, a red river that threatened to reach his elbow. He lay on the bed like a broken statue while she worked, his breathing a halting metronome. The candles flamed like small suns, and the room smelled of iron and spice. The king watched her as if she were a map and not a person. His gaze charted the tremor in her hands and found it wanting. She had not intended anything more than to close the wound. She had been trained to patch and to bind, not to offer solaces. Yet there was a moment, as she pressed linen to his skin, when something ancient and anciently feminine throbbed under her sternum, a pull like a moon on the tides. The fortress hummed in an unfamiliar key, and the wound answered as if it recognized her touch. The blood slowed and, impossibly, the edges knit, in a way that should have demanded months of bed rest and specialized poultices. He opened his eyes and met hers, and in that gaze, the world compressed to an unbearable pinpoint of realization. "You healed me," he said. It was not a statement that sought gratitude so much as a confession that startled him. "You bled," she said. Words that might as well have been prayers slipped between them. Her skin felt like a drum skin stretched taut. For the next few days, the king watched her with more intensity than any sovereign did for any servant. The court noticed, as courts do. Rumor spun itself into an opulent scarf and draped it across the halls. Some suggested she had cursed him. Others suggested she was a witch. A few returned to the more familiar gossip of a bargain. None of the guesses saw the truth. Asha's touch had done something between a miracle and a natural law that had not been taught in the village when she had been a girl. The pull grew like a secret until it was too loud to ignore. Asha began to have dreams in which the king spoke with the voice of a boy who remembered being small and wronged. She dreamt of wolves who did not howl, and of hands that feared being held. The dream voices were not accusatory, they were longing. Each morning she woke with a new ache that was less about patient limbs and more about a hunger she had not known she could feel. It terrified her. She had been taught that the heart was a traitor, and all forgeries began with small tendernesses. One night, after a council had bled itself dry of intrigue, the king summoned her to his private gardens. The moon held its breath, and the world folded into a softness that felt like a conspiracy. He stood by a fountain that reflected the stars, and when he spoke he used terms she had heard only in stories. My son, my blood, my heir. He did not call her out. He asked a question that rippled through her like a blade. Are you bound? The question had many potential meaning, like a forked road with maps that would not show themselves. Asha thought of the word as the market used it, bound as in bought. She thought of it as the court used it, bound as in duty. She thought of it as the wolves used it, bound as in blood. She could not say yes. She should not have said yes. But the true confession left her as if she had been carved into. I am bound to my craft, she said. It was the only answer that tasted true. I was bound to my mother's debts. I was bound to hunger. I do not know the bond you mean. He looked at her as if she had untangled a skein. You are a healer, and a healer can bind life to life. It is an old thing, once practiced in the northern wilds, a pity we do not teach anymore. You may not mean to, Asha. Yet, the king's blood thinned around you like snow near a lantern. It should have been a threat. Instead, it felt like admission. Perhaps the fortress had been starving for a companion and had mistaken tender hands for hunger. The king's voice lowered. If what you do was practiced in old rites, then you have ties. If you have ties, then you are closer to me than anyone that does not bear my name. The night grew cold, not because the moon commanded it, but because power shifted like a puzzle piece. Asha felt the first stab of something that would not be undone. Power whispered in her ear that it would rewrite the ledger that had listed her as nothing. Fear skittered up her spine. She had no illusions about how the court would take a woman who could change the shape of a king's fate. The guards would be suspicious. Her brothers would barter what remained of her dignity. And most terrifyingly, she did not know whether the king would want her for himself or destroy her for the risk she posed. The notion of forced proximity was not new to her. Prisons had varying grades. In the fortress, a different form of imprisonment applied, the kind where the key was not chains, but the eyes of a man who refused to let you forget that you were property of his attention. He ordered her to live within the private wing. He issued a chain of directives that dealt with little else than placing her where he could find her. The court called it security. The servants called it routine. She called it a fate that made hunger feel like the old life. Simpler. There were soft mercies in the imprisonment. She was not starved. The kitchens were generous. The king summoned her in the quiet hours, and he would watch her as she arranged herbs on a tray, with the focus of a man who read everything like a treaty. He asked questions only a broken person would ask, whether things could be fixed when they were made of old sorrow, whether a person could change the way the court saw them. He refused to answer questions about his past. The answer would have been a sign of surrender, and the king did not allow signs of surrender. The bond that tied them was more than a rumor. Anatomy proved stubborn, and laws of blood were older than politics. Their nights were fraught with friction and recognition, and in the heat between them, Asha discovered a gift that had been hidden by shame and neglect. She found she could do more than heal flesh. She could ease the knot of his memory. When she put her palm to the hollow behind his ear where nerve and story knotted, she felt a pulse that was older than him. It responded to her fingers as if acknowledging kin. The king, who had been guarded like a temple, allowed himself in small ways to be unarmored. He unrolled his history in fragments. The loneliness of being a son raised to be a pillar. The ritual that had cost him a childhood. The secret that had turned him into a monarch who preferred fear to kinship. He also showed her cruelty that made her raw. When she tried to ask why he had barricaded his heart from the sun, he would lean away with an old hurt sharpened into authority. He had not been spared the world, he told her in a voice that cut white, and so he returned the scale of pain. The court had taught him to be a god, and gods did not need tender hands. He told her that trust was a currency that people spent and never repaid. Yet when guards came to claim someone he had loved in a story from his youth, he flared like an animal and let her see the thing that gnawed him, regret. Her care did not make him less ruler. She learned to read him as she read cracked skin and fevered brow. She learned when his temper would flare and when the silence meant he had retreated into himself. She learned how to navigate his terrors and his small mercies. They argued sometimes, their words sharp as blades that left no blood but left edges that would later catch the light. Their conversations curled around topics men of power avoided, what it meant to be loved, whether duty justified cruelty, whether lineage could be more than a legal paper the court could use as weapon. Outside the fortress, the world tore itself into more obvious dangers. The king's uncle, High Lord Valen, personified the disease of tradition. He was charming in the way rot looks like honey and used law like a blade. He spoke loudly in council about purity and the sanctity of the bloodline. He saw Asha like a stain on his dignity. He saw the king's interest in her like heresy and the audience with her as insult. He plotted, not with the violence of open war, but with subtler, colder machinations. Favored marriages, whispered accusations, and the slow erosion of political capital. He would not stand for a healer from a disgraced family influencing the king. Asha noticed the way the courtiers aligned like wolf packs, and she developed a taste for the politics by necessity. People underestimated her because she moved with softness rather than strategy. They forgot that softness could be a tool. It could misdirect. She watched Valen's eyes with the hunger of a woman who had been starved long enough to know the sound of an empty larder. He admired the power of institutions the way a hunter admires the shape of a net. If he could smear her with scandal, he would have not only rid himself of the discomfort she represented, but repaired the rent in his ambitions. One evening, Valen made his move. He arranged a banquet that showcased a candidate for the next queen, a woman of impeccable lineage, knives softened into smiles. He ensured the advisor favored a public announcement that the king would take a consort to secure the throne's line. The fortress hummed with the machinery of ceremony and political scent. The king, who was normally composed in public, sent for Asha during the banquet with an urgency that made servants whisper. The call to the healer in public was rare and implied either a great wound or a greater scandal. Whispers multiplied. When Asha arrived at the royal chamber, she saw the king in an unusual, unarmored state. Sleeves pushed back, sleeves showing bare arms that had earned their lines. He wore a cloak, but the heat in his face broke through the practiced calm. He had been in the throne room when Valen made the suggestion. She had seen the twist of his hand, the scar pooling dark like a map. Valen moved like a spider in court, conspicuous and invisible at once. When the king looked at her, the question in his eyes had edges it had not had before. Not suspicion, but protest. Protest sounded like wind and sometimes grew to a storm. "He wants to name a consort tonight," the king said, and the words were the blunt instrument of a man with little appetite for subtleties. "He will try to secure the line with someone who brings him favor." Asha's heart beat loud in her throat. It was not only that the king might choose a different partner, though that would leave her vulnerable, but because a public betrothal would mean the king claimed the court's line openly, and in doing so, he might deny the strange, growing tether she felt in her bones. She should have been an instrument, not a participant. She should have been the silent hand that healed and then returned to the margins. She realized she had become something he might claim in ways that frightened both of them. She stepped forward because the room required an answer, and not because bravery had arrived. "There is no reason your majesty cannot choose both reason and a tender heart," she said. It was a small retort and a foolish one, but it reached him in a way even blunt power could not. He allowed himself to laugh, a sound like gravel rearranging itself. He did what no one expected. He walked into the public room and stopped Valen's show without the sword that people expected of a king. He announced something not of consultation, but of declaration. He said that the court would not call forth a consort tonight. He said his line would be his to name and his alone. He said that those who wished to press the matter would see the court's doors closed to them. Where once silence would have been his tool, he chose confrontation. Valen reddened as if stung and slunk away like an animal who had lost the sun. The court watched and found new reasons to be afraid. The king, in his declaration, had also, in effect, recognized Asha's place beside him. Whether he meant to crown her or merely to insult Valen, the recognition altered the ledger. People like to write histories. They rewrite them when embers appear. After that night, the fortress shifted like tectonic plates. Allies and enemies reformed. Some courtiers favored a union between the king and someone noble, while others sought an opportunity. The southern houses sniffed like hounds that had caught a new scent. Asha, once invisible as she was, became a pivot point. Power wrapped around her, the way a vine wraps a tree. The vine did not choke the tree necessarily, but sometimes it did. Then came the attack, not a whisper or a schemer's knife, but the clean violence of a planned strike. Ashan, a lord from the outer regions and a man who excused cruelty with lineage, coordinated a raid that coincided with an important diplomatic convocation. Smoke and steel filled the outer courtyards. Soldiers died. Nobles who had arrived with smiles now lay with the shocked look of people who had had their fate decided in an instant. The fortress became a body under assault, and Asha, the hands that held it together. The king's vulnerability revealed itself under such pressure. His temper flared and then closed into something smaller. He moved through the battlefield within the courtyard like a wounded god, to be worshipped or ignored by turns. In the pit of the turmoil, a bomb intended for the throne room detonated, and a shard of iron found the king's side. Blood sprayed like a story no one wanted to read. He fell against the stones, his breath a ragged thing I thought I had enough of. Guards panicked and uncoiled. Valen, who had been repealed from court, used the moment to step in with his own brand of merciless authority, calling for reform in the name of safety. Asha reached him as if carried by a current. She sank to her knees on the cold stone and pressed her palm over the wound as if it were matte paper. A bruise bloomed like a night-blooming flower under her hand, and the metal in it sang, with a note she had never heard. The king's eyes were wide, not with fear this time, but with a rare naked thing, the knowledge that he was mortal in front of her. He did not look to his guards or to the council. He looked only at her. "You must do it," he said, as if she had been the one to command whether. "You must bind this." Asha had never been asked, no, commanded, to do anything like this. Her craft had not prepared her for a wound that thrummed with politics and old magic. There was metal, yes, but there was also a thread of something old, a binding meant to keep him always distant from the warmth of others. He had broken that binding on some nights when she pressed her hand to his chest and felt the heat of a human life inside. It had mattered more than she was comfortable naming. She worked as if someone else were manipulating her hands. She made a poultice of moonflower and nettle and bloodroot, a recipe she had read in a book that had once belonged to the woman who had taught her how to bandage. She spoke words her mother had whispered in some other tongue because words tied things. She pressed her hands over the wound and felt a shock of something like connection, not the king's fear, but his trust falling like dew. It was more terrifying than any blade. Asha's binding did not simply close the wound. It laced the old spell with the new line of blood and with a current of something old and feminine. The fortress held its breath and then exhaled. The king's pulse steadied. He looked at her with a softness carved from terror and gratitude, and for a moment the court held still. The scream of the raid dulled to a memory. There was the sound of wood crackling somewhere in the outer yard, and the taste of iron on the night air, but also a new quiet, the knowledge that something intimate had happened inside the walls. The attack left both outward scars and inner tremors. The court punished men, and the king's inner circle shrunk and hardened. Valen used the chaos to push the court into measures that would grant him more power. He did not insist on marriage, but on political bondage, a council appointment that would give him the sway he wanted. The king gave in on paper, but in no meaningful way. His concessions were like smoke, visible, but not solid. Asha saw him make the political calculations, and she saw him change his mind, like a man who was learning to feel again. It was a dangerous education. Then something happened that neither of them expected. Asha discovered she was with child. At first, the discovery was private, an irritant of nausea she could not ignore, and the dimness of the night that lasted longer than it should. She suspected other reasons, and then she found the small proof in her body. The idea of pregnancy in the fortress read like a bold line through a manuscript. There were rules about lineage and bloodlines and who could produce heirs. Asha did not fit any of them. She was a healer. She was Omega. She was a woman who had been scorned and traded in her village like a minor slur. She told the king not because she wanted to force his hand, but because she feared the consequences of being discovered by others. She found him alone in the kitchen, where soup simmered, and the smell of old bread coated the air. He sat with his elbows on the table, the same stoic mask he wore when the world tried to tear at him. She did not need to explain. She saw the way his jaw pinched and then relaxed the instant the news landed. His hand went to his chest, where a place might have been softened by some memory, and he let out a single breath that might have been a laugh if it had not come out like a sound held in a cage. "You are carrying my heir," he said, and the words were both proclamation and a chain link. The logic of a kingdom rearranged itself like tectonic plates. Asha felt suddenly like a tree uprooted and replanted. The soil changed, the sky different. She felt fear, raw and cold, and also a kind of ecstatic terror. She saw what it meant in the faces of the servants she told in quiet. Some bowed their heads in sorrow because they expected the worst. Others touched their hands to their own hearts and blessed her. The delivery of the news did not go smoothly. Valen raged as if the universe had unjustly allowed a stone to be dropped on his plans. He accused Asha of witchcraft in the hallways as if the accusation of magic might alter the fact of the child. He told the king that taking a woman like Asha as the mother of his bloodline would undermine the court's reputation. He called her a stain. The court that had once shrugged at her became a machine for othering, for making the strange familiar and thus acceptable. The king's response was complicated. He defended her in moments that felt like hands stroking embers. He told his council that the lineage would be recognized, and there would be no shame. He refused to be shamed. He told Valen in private that if the court sought to remove Asha, they would have to remove him first. He meant it. He meant it with a clarity that scared even his old supporters. But he also retreated sometimes into a silence so profound that Asha could see his fear like a cut on his palm. Their relationship tightened and stretched in ways that tested them both. People either rallied around them or moved like wolves toward a fresh kill. Asha learned the bitter calculus of court life. She learned who would stand with them at the council and who would claim neutrality. She saw friends made and friends lost, and she learned that the same men who had given her praise for a healed burn could look at her like a threat when her belly rounded. In the private hours, their intimacy grew into a complicated arrangement of need and tenderness. He would hold her with a grip that said he meant to be careful, and she would yield until she felt the need to climb away and breathe. She learned the geography of his vulnerabilities. She learned the small ritual of making a man who had given up on being held accept the shape of touch. He, in turn, let her see a child he had known once. The king had loved and lost before. He told her about his mother and the nights before he was crowned when he had felt like a broken instrument being tuned into a public performance. He cried once, and the sound cracked the stone around them. Not everything slid neatly into place. The court continued to be a furnace where knives were reheated. Valen's plots dissolved into more complicated weavings. He arranged for Asha, a disgraced noble who had allied with him, to insinuate a rumor that Asha had been enchanted. The suggestion was low and crude, but its effect was like a die. People began to question the validity of the child. Was it truly the king's? Did the child hold some curse? The court demanded proof, in the form of ritual tests and blood rites that were cruel in their opacity. Asha had avoided mystical tests before, because they were designed to humiliate women who had no recourse. She had survived the village's shame by being silent. Now she had a child inside her, and a king who loved her, and a fortress that called for proof. The council proposed a ritual that would reveal the truth, or at least make a public display of the alignment of blood. It was a ceremony that called upon old rites where a woman had to be stripped of both physical protection and privacy, while men observed and declared her innocence or guilt based on their perceptions. It was a vestige of a patriarchal set of rules designed to protect men's claims and women's compliance. The king refused at first. His words were blunt and angry. "No," he said, and he meant it. "No test in front of this court." Valen called his refusal cowardice. He called the king a man who hid like any other when faced with a test. The argument grew heated in corridors where tapestries listened, and the night smelled of iron. Asha felt the question like an animal at the edge of a cliff. The king clenched his jaw and finally said it. "If you will not go through the test, do you consent to a private one? I will be present. I will not allow them to humiliate you." She did not want any test. She wanted the world to accept her on the basis of what she had done: heal, hold, and keep the child safe. But she could see the way the council sharpened their knives for public debate, and she could see the way Valen wanted the scandal badly enough to use any tool. She agreed to the private test because there was no other way to make the storm stop. The night of the private rite was a place where power and secrecy braided together. The king stood in front of her in a way that made her belly swell with the knowledge that he could not pretend not to be human. He said his vows without the court's pomp. He promised that whether the child was his or not, he would protect her. The ritual the two of them agreed on was old, nearly obsolete. It required the midwife's authority, the healer's hands, and the king's oath. There would be no public spectacle. Instead, there would be a trust they extended to one another, a clearing that said what the court could not demand, that they would be more than rumor. They performed the ritual under a low sky that smelled of lavender and the musk of men. Asha's hands shook as she pressed the leaves of a plant learned in the wilds between her palms. The king's hands were steady because he was practicing not to be afraid. He placed his hands on either side of her belly, and he said the words of oath. "Blood bears witness." He kissed her hand afterward, as if it were something fragile. The touch stayed inside her, for days like a lantern she could return to for warmth. When the child was born, it was as if the world had been made anew. The delivery was quiet and fierce. Asha labored with the focus of a woman who had been scraped by hardship and powered by a courage less visible, but no less real. The king paced as one paces when there is a storm inside the house. He returned to the room when the cries began, and he saw the child first as something small and crying, but then as a portal. The child had dark hair like night, a nose affectionately crooked like something familiar, and a cry so fierce it could have announced sovereignty. Everyone in the private room exhaled. The midwife hummed a tune that dated back to the villages, and the king, against the tide of generations, wept in a way that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with relief. When they told the court of the child, the response was explosive and then slowly rearranged itself like tectonic plates finding their new seam. There were people who cheered because the king had chosen his own path. There were others who muttered and tried to see the child as a symbol of impropriety. Valen seethed and tried to find a way to tarnish the child's lineage, but the court could not deny an infant's presence. The child had been made by flesh and breath and a small, private ritual. Its existence was a fact that tampered with institutions. Asha's status began to shift in the most unanticipated way, from outcast to matriarch in a way that had nothing to do with a title and everything to do with being the mother of the heir. People gave way to her in courtyards, not purely from fear, but from curiosity, and then from respect tempered by the knowledge that children shape dynasties. The women in the kitchens who had once glanced with avoidance now brought her small gifts: a loaf of bread, a jar of herbal infusion designed to strengthen milk. Even those who had been neutral now found ways to be useful. It was a new kind of power, domestic and raw, the influencer of a line. The king changed as well. He had always been a man who could command a room, but his commands started to bend in ways that made people notice. He became protective of the child in ways that had nothing to do with politics, and everything to do with a man who had found something he could not let go. Sometimes he would sit by the child for hours and not move, only watching, like a man memorizing a map he had not thought he needed. He would bring the child to the private wing where Asha could heal him, and in those moments, he looked like a man who had found a harbor. Valen persisted in his attempts to undermine them. He found men who were dissatisfied enough to try to create a whisper that the child would not survive due to a hidden curse. He bribed detested midwives and attempted to get them to claim the child was sick. He aligned with Acha to make a rumor of the child's death, and then the child's removal, so that he could present a candidate more amenable to his goals. But each attempt flamed out, because the child's life was guarded not only by a king, but by the skill of a woman who had been trained in silence. There was a final confrontation that would determine whether their union could matter in the eyes of the court, and whether the king could ever choose compassion over fear. Valen organized a civil expectation, a parade of nobles demanding an heir's health be publicly certified. He would make a show, and in that show, the king would have to either bow to the will of the council or refuse and risk civil disobedience. The day of the parade arrived with the pomp of a battle. Streets thrummed with onlookers who came to see whether the king would bend. The king stood in front of them with his child wrapped in his arms. His expression was rigid as a blade. Asha stood behind him within the inner courtyard, cloaked and silent, because she did not trust the crowd to be tender. Valen spat accusations from the dais, and the council moved like predators prepared to pounce. The thing about public life is that it feeds on spectacle. It needs a drama to survive. Valen's final act was a question shaped like an ultimatum. Will you allow this child to be the legend of our time while their mother remains a common healer? Asha stepped forward before anyone could arrange for her to be humiliated. She did not speak like a woman pleading. She spoke like someone who had learned the rhythm of her own voice. I am not merely a healer. I am the woman who held your king when he was broken. I am the woman who kept him whole when he nearly died. I am the mother of the child who will someday sit where he sits. If you choose to diminish me, you choose to diminish the future." Her words landed with the force of truth. The crowd shifted, and something like a hush swept across the stands. The king watched her as if he could still not believe she had said such things in public. He stepped forward and placed the child back in Asha's arms, as if bestowing power by touch. He said, with a voice that carried to every corner of the courtyard, that Asha was acknowledged as his mate and as the mother of his heir. He declared that the court's rules would henceforth require respect for any who bore the king's line. The declaration was revolutionary and petty, both practical and loving. Valen's face crumpled in a fury that was slow and dangerous. He arranged for a last attempt at subterfuge, a desperate bribe to a guard who had been promised the title of captain and lands in exchange for removing the child from the castle at night. It was an assassination that did not involve a blade so much as betrayal and the easy use of proximity. The guard, who had been drinking the night the bribe was delivered, stumbled as he moved with the child, and the plan failed, largely because his heart misfired the first wrong command. But the attempt left one consequence neither Valen nor the guard expected. In the tumble, the child, the king's heir, fell and struck the stones, and the silence that followed was dense as a curtain. The child cried, but the cry was thin and tinkling, as if caught by gravity. Frightened mothers in the crowd gasped. The king ran with the pace of a man who had been turned into something else, who had been given a new kind of desperation. He scooped the child and saw blood. The world turned small. Asha's hands went to the wound like instinct. She touched the child's temple and felt something inside like an echo. A dark thing had stirred, an old curse Valen might have called on if he could. The child's life hung like an object too precious for handling. The king's eyes were alive with fear. He moved to sing the old lullaby his mother had taught him, but the lullaby had no effect. The midwife helplessly shook her head. Asha recognized the symptoms of an old rot, a curse that delighted in blood and in lines cut short. Her position in court had always been a paradox, despised enough to be a target, but close enough to matter. She realized with a cold clarity that cures that were not physical required other kinds of bravery. She would need to use a forbidden ritual she had learned in the wilds years ago, one that mothers and healers used when midwives failed, and the world seemed to demand a price. The ritual required her to bind blood to blood and to trade a part of herself for the child's safety. It demanded the surrendering of a thing she had always held as a private fortress, her own future liberty. She could do the binding, she had the knowledge, but the cost would change her life. She would bind her warmth to another and lose some part of her solitude forever. She did not hesitate, because the king's face was there in the courtyard, every word of the court's pronouncement still fresh. He took her hands and did not try to argue her into surrender. He offered the solemnity of someone who had been a man most feared, and had never considered choosing his own fear for the sake of love. He said in a voice that had rocked the kingdom, "Do it." Asha set her palms over the child's wound and sang the old words into the night. The words tasted of an orchard and the salt of sea. The binding pulled into her like a thread hole, and then it drew out of her, as if the child's life needed a counterweight. She felt the cost like a stone pressing the center of her being. She gave what the ritual demanded, a measure of her freedom and the name no one had given to her before: mate. It was not a romantic word, at first, but instead a legal term that had become something holy. The child's breath steadied slowly as if a choked river had found a new channel. The blood slowed. The world around them breathed again. The king kissed her then, with a fierceness that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with gratitude. "You are mine in more ways than the crown can claim," he whispered between teeth. Word spread as if the fortress itself had sent messengers in the night. The court had known they would be tested. They had not expected Asha to save the heir. Valen attempted to spin the event into further scandal, that such rituals were dangerous, and that the king had been reckless. But his words collided with the truth like wind against stone. The king had been willing to risk reputation for the sake of a child, and for the woman who had bound herself to that child. Valen found himself increasingly isolated, the mantle of power not matched by the willingness to be brave when required. The bond Asha and the king shared became public not only in law and ceremony, but in the quiet acts that make a life. He began to treat her as a partner in governance, listening to her counsel on matters where she had once been dismissed. She taught him how to value people rather than fear them. He taught her how to set boundaries when the court tried to devour them. Together they navigated the slow reform required to temper a kingdom that had long favored cruelty over compassion. There were times when the king's old habits returned, and they would argue fiercely until words left them both drained. There were also nights when the child's small hands curled around Asha's finger, and she felt the center of her life settle into place. Asha's ascension to respect was not immediate, nor did it erase the shadow of being a woman from the wrong side of the ledger. There were fights to be waged. Valen continued to work in the shadows until his final attempt to seize the throne. He had amassed discontent, and the final revolt would have broken like a wave at the fortress, if not for a combination of loyal guards, strategic alliances brokered by those who had seen Asha's saving touch, and the king's own willingness to stand and be counted. The rebellion raged for a season, pitting families and factions against each other, and the king had to choose again and again whether to hold to old cruelty or to step into vulnerability. The final battle was a blur of steel and cunning. Valen launched a night raid intending to capture the king and carry him away. He expected to find the throne empty and the fortress in chaos. Instead, he found a man who had learned to ask for help and a healer who no longer would be made small. Asha stood beside the king in ways no one could have predicted. She moved through the trenches and wards like a seasoned commander of small mercies, setting healers where needed and carrying messages like a sword. She could not be intimidated by Valen because the court had made her too resilient. She was, in the end, a force not because she had learned war, but because she had learned to be necessary. Valen was arrested after his last desperate attempt, and his supporters scattered. The king insisted on mercy for some and justice for others, an approach that earned him respect, because it demanded the courage not just to punish, but to rebuild. He spoke publicly about the nature of power and the need for care. He spoke about Asha in terms that were unwelcome to men like Valen, but necessary for a kingdom that needed to learn temperance. Asha rose in rank not because of a crown, but because she occupied a place that made sense to the court: mate of the king, mother of the heir, healer of a line. People found reasons to praise her softness and to respect her resolve. She opened clinics that taught the old healing arts to women who had been refused formal recognition. She worked to institute laws that protected midwives and quiet petitions to the court that would prevent a woman's reputation from being destroyed by rumor. The work was slow and sometimes felt like patching a ship in a storm, but she persisted, steady as the hand that once learned to bind a wound on a king's forearm. Life, ineffably, bloomed. The king and Asha bore one child and then another. Their family became both a symbol and a reality of a kingdom rounding toward a kinder future. They married in a private ceremony that made the stone in their chests melt into something tender. Children called the king father and called Asha mother. The king learned to sit and listen the way a good ruler should, and Asha learned to use her voice like a tool that could cut or heal. The fortress changed. Guards smiled more often, and the halls lost the bitter edge of fear. People from villages who had once been dismissed as unproductive workers found their craft honored. The old council still existed, but their teeth had been filed by the king's insistence that governance must mean service. The laws rebalanced to include compassion as a tenet rather than a luxury. Valen faded as a cautionary tale. He either was forgiven or faded into exile. History treated him with an ambivalence that suits men who try to hold on to the past. The court learned a difficult lesson, that power without softness shrivels into accusation and violence, but power with tenderness bore fruit that fed more than it consumed. The king learned slowly to be seen as a man who could love, and as a man who could be loved by someone who had once been told to be small. Asha learned that she was not a stain and never had been. She had been a woman who could heal and a woman who could love. The villagers who had once whispered Omega came to visit sometimes, bringing trinkets and gossip. She forgave some, not for their sake, but because forgiveness made her breathing easier. She became a person who was known for the way she listened to a child's cough, and for the way she argued for a law that would ensure a child of any house could be cared for if they became ill. The fortress grew warmer in winters, and the market sold bread that smelled better than it had in a generation. When the king walked the streets, he did so with Asha at his side, not as an emblem, but as a partner. They raised a family that grew like the trees planted in the courtyard, slowly, stubbornly, and with deep roots. People were kinder in public, as if the presence of a woman who had once been called lesser had compressed societies into gentleness. It did not change the whole world overnight, but it shifted the arc of their kingdom toward something steadier. 1 year after the child's birth, they stood on the balcony that overlooked the same courtyard where riots and declarations and the edges of an empire had once defined them. Their firstborn, now toddling and laughing like a small son, clutched a ribbon and ran toward the guards who had once been monsters in rumor. The second child, with Asha in her arms, sucked a thumb the way children do when secure. The king watched them both with a softness that matched the moon. Asha's hair still carried smudges of soot from the forge of governance. Sometimes she laughed and admitted to old fears. The king would reach for her hand, and when he did, she felt the familiar, impossible tether they shared. They had weathered public humiliation, an assault on the throne, a curse that might have killed a child, and the unasked dread of lineage politics. They had emerged not unscarred but intact. They had also transformed more than their household. Asha's clinics thrived in villages that had been previously ignored. The midwives sang songs that had been forbidden in the old council's name. The king instituted reforms for apprentices who had once been denied training. He rebalanced taxes slightly in favor of those who worked the land and the women who kept houses. He started a charter that recognized healers formally so they could not be easily dismissed by officials. The kingdom adapted not because a single mind decided it was good, but because a family chose to embody a gentler law. The court learned to address them differently. Nobles who once scoffed at Asha found reasons to bring their infirm children for treatment. There were arguments at the council and blunt efforts to reclaim authority, but each attempt waned under the weight of public goodwill. Power by fear had been replaced by a different currency: connection. It did not make Valen forgetfulness, but it muted his capacity to harm. Asha dreamed sometimes of her village like it had never been left. She returned once after a year with the children and a retinue of guards who were less imposing, because the welcome she received was kinder than remembered. Her mother wept when she saw the face of the child who had become a center. Her brothers, who had once bartered her as if she were a piece of cloth, bowed and then later spoke to her with a sincerity that made Asha's heart both ache and expand. The king, who had once believed power required isolation, walked into the village with a humility that puzzled some and delighted others. He visited the priest who had once judged them, and spoke of a future in which people could be judged less by past grievances and more by their actions. The priest did not change overnight, but even he shifted slightly in the way he pronounced blessings. The town festival returned that year, but with a different flavor. The games continued, and the pomp too, but they also added a ceremony of healing where Asha and other healers tended to the wounded as a public show, not of humiliation, but of shared tenderness. Children ran in the square, and the king and Asha joined forces for the storytelling tent, where they told tales of old where kings and healers had saved each other. The people listened and learned. One night, sitting in the private garden with their children asleep inside the house, the king reached for Asha's hand and said something that had been rare in his words. "You saved not only my son," he said, "but what I thought I had lost long ago, the part of me that believed in people." Asha looked at him like someone does at a map and then at the sky. "You saved me too," she said. "You made it possible for me to be someone who is seen." He smiled then, a small fissure in his old armor, and his eyes had the light of a man who had found something for which he would protect a world. "We are far from perfect," he admitted. "We are far from everything," she said, but she said it with a kind of joy. "But we are together." They did not need to shout their triumphs from the towers. The work of changing a kingdom whispered in the slow changes of law, the quiet culture of the fortress, the clinics that provided for children, and a mother who could heal a child's wound with hands that had once been taught to be small. The children grew and played, and sometimes argued about who would one day rule. The king and Asha argued sometimes too, in the way old lovers do, keeping guard over the balance of ruling and raising a family. Valen was given a fair trial and then exile, not only as a justice, but as a statement. The court needed to show that cruelty would not be rewarded. Men who had once supported him shifted toward quieter counsel. There were still plots, of course. Power never lets go easily, and there would be further testing in years to come. Yet the kingdom had a new axis made of tenderness, and a ruler who could admit fear, and a queen who could teach people how to heal. On the anniversary of the child's birth, they stood in a courtyard full of laughter, and the king raised his cup of unsweetened wine in a toast that surprised even the old guards. He spoke not only about lineage, but about the woman beside him, who had been called an Omega, and had become the center of a line. He said the word mate out loud in a way that made certain ears prick with attention, and he named Asha more than any title. The honoring of her did not remove complexity, but it made public the truth, that a woman who had once been marginalized could save not only a life, but a line. Asha thought often of how she had been folded into herself as a child, and then how, piece by piece, she had learned to unfold and to hold the weight of a kingdom's future. There had been nights where she had counted the costs and wondered whether she had paid too high a price. There had been moments of private loss in which she had felt the empty space where liberty might once have been. But the children's laughter, the rewritten laws, the small reverence of a village that now saw healers as essential, all of that made her breathing more easy. When the king and Asha walked along the fortress wall and watched the sun sink into the farmland, she rested her head against his shoulder and felt his heartbeat. It was steady because they had learned to be steady together. He had taught her that authority could be wielded with restraint, and she had taught him that trust was not a weakness, but an instrument. They had both been changed by the thing that had begun in a wound and had grown into a life. A child born in the shadow of steel, who had created a future of surprising softness. The years that followed were not perfectly smooth. There were political storms and medical crises that tested even her skill. There were moments of mourning, but the arc of their life leaned at last toward a kind of composted peace that fed the next generation. Children of commoners had access to training, healers had official recognition, and the court had earned a reputation for a governance that showed restraint when power could easily have crushed dissent, and for a tenderness that forbade the worst abuses of the old laws. At night, when the house was quiet and the children slept with the steadfastness of the young, Asha would sometimes go to the window and remember the market and the ledger and the moment a man with a seal had pronounced her name. She would think of the first time she had sewn a wound on the king's arm and not known what that touch would mean. She would then look toward the cradle and watch the child sleep, and she would feel gratitude bloom in the hollow where loneliness used to live. Valen faded as a lesson, and the court's whisper transformed into voice. He became history rather than present danger, and his mistakes taught the king to be more vigilant. Other threats rose and fell. The world never rested from the hungry. Through it all, Asha kept the clinics and taught the apprentices and tended the wounded and the griefs of the people. She was no longer only the wife of the king. She had become a woman who had a legacy of kindness to pass on. One autumn, an envoy arrived from a distant kingdom, seeking the hand of their child in policy, not affection. They came with silver tongues and promises of trade. The king, who had once measured everything by power alone, considered the offer, and then with Asha beside him, decided upon a partnership that balanced interest and compassion. The decision showed that the court had access to new kinds of diplomacy, now that the king's heart had been steadied by a woman who had taught him trust. The children grew and learned the arts of leadership and the recipes of healing. They were taught with the intensity of a family who had seen how much of old life could break into shards otherwise. The heir, the child, who had once been so fragile, grew to be a thoughtful and fierce leader, taught by both parents to temper strength with mercy. The other child learned the craft of stories and songs and would later travel outside the kingdom, bringing back tales that knit neighboring lands closer. In private, Asha and the king found new ways to be with each other. He built a small room in the private wing that smelled of paper and lavender where she could read and teach. She taught him to look people in the eye, not as opponents, but as living things deserving of consideration. He taught her how to sit with power and how to let it be worn not as a mask, but as a responsibility. Their love was quiet and wide, a fabric that did not tear easily. When their firstborn took a seat beside the king to hear petitions, Asha watched with a mother's pride that cut a little edge in the chest and then softened. She had once been told she would never matter, that she was flawed by birth and lack. She had been told to be small. She had not been small. She had been necessary. The fortress now had its festivals and its laws and the clinics that hummed like beehives. Children ran in the courtyard like small fires of future. The king and Asha had found the balance between public and private, between ruling and being present. Power softened not because it gave in to sentiment, but because it had learned that the strength of a ruler could be its kindness. Years later, walking hand in hand through the market, Asha paused at a stall and saw a girl sweeping dust with the same careful economy she had once perfected. The girl's hands were small and already calloused. When the girl looked up, Asha met her gaze, and for a moment, the world rearranged in such a way that Asha could see herself as a child and as a woman all at once. She knelt and adjusted the girl's scarf in a small practical motion and did not announce who she was. The girl blinked at the small kindness and went on. Asha rose and kept walking with the king at her side. They passed the stall and beyond it the fortress wall and the fields stitched with light. The smell of bread and the sound of children's laughter rose, and the king tightened his hand around hers. They did not speak immediately. The silence between them had a history that made words unnecessary. He finally said low, "You made us better." She answered, "So did you." The days went on, and the children grew, and 1 year slid into the next. There were still nights where the king's face would go blank in memory of the old hurt, and where Asha would sit and hold him until the silence passed. There were also nights when he would touch her forehead and thank her for binding him to a life he had once thought he would never have. Years after they had first met, and the hand with the king's seal had chosen her, Asha stood in the court as a woman recognized not for the stains of her past, but for the substance of her doing. People looked to her for healing, not only of flesh, but of law. She had taught a kingdom to be kinder. She had bound a life to hers and not been consumed. She had become mate, mother, and a healer who reshaped the political landscape with the quiet efficiency of a woman who once knew how to make herself small and had then chosen not to. The story of the healer from the market became, in time, a story told during the Festival of Wolves. It was told not as a cautionary tale of danger, but as a lesson that the sharpest edge of power is another kind of responsibility, and that tenderness has a way of changing law. Children sat wide-eyed when the bard sang of Asha's fingers and of the king's vulnerability. Old men nodded, and some middle-aged women allowed themselves to close their eyes for a moment. When the king and Asha were old by the standards of the court, and thin men and women told strange tales of past rulers, they still walked the market hand in hand, and their grandchildren ran around them like small sons. The fortress, which had once been a place of cold stone, had become a house where people went to be tended and where leaders sometimes came to learn what tenderness looked like. In the end, it was not the throne that changed them so much as the small choices. A hand stayed, a word refused, a ritual performed in secrecy. Theirs was a life that had been carved out of difficult choices. They had built a family and a kingdom that reflected the thing they believed most. That power's truest measure was not how many you could make bow, but how many you would keep safe. And on a quiet night, a year after the child had been born and long after the final battle had settled into history, Asha sat on the balcony and watched her children sleep in the house below. The king leaned his head against hers and breathed a prayer, not to the gods, but to the future. The wind held the scent of wheat and the distant laughter of a village that had learned to be kinder. They had, against the long arc of a world that prized cruelty, built a place where small mercies were law. Asha smiled and felt, deep and steady, the truth she had once discovered in an unassuming hand, that to be seen was to be changed, and that smallest hands could bind not only wounds, but the fate of a kingdom